Today's thought topic: separation of money and state. What is it and why do we need it? Separation of money and state is kind of like separation of church and state. For thousands of years, there was no separation between church and state. So you had the governing bodies that were also the spiritual leaders of the day. Nowadays, you don't see very many countries where the church also controls the state. It's kind of an antiquated model, but a good example of that would be the Vatican. So the power and influence of the church, or someone like the Pope, was also the power of the government. Hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, that was very much the norm. It actually probably would have been pretty difficult for the average citizen back then to imagine any other way. Religion was probably so ingrained in society and such a part of abiding by the law, abiding by God's law, that I'm assuming very few people questioned it or could even spot the difference between church and state. It took a lot of the Protestant leaders of the time to step up and, in a very bloody way, rebel against that system. Before the Protestant leaders could get anyone behind their cause, they first had to explain the difference between the powers of the church, having authority over spiritual practices, and the power of the state, having legislative powers, government powers. So with the Protestant movement and the Reformation, we saw a revolution idea come about that was the separation of church and state. And though it wasn't executed perfectly, even into modern times, it still created a huge difference between the monopoly on spiritual practice and monopoly on power into the modern version of religion and government being separate. What's interesting about this is that at the same time that all of this was happening, where people were starting to kind of wake up to the idea of there even being a possible separation of church and state, there was also a new technology emerging, the Gutenberg press, in a way decentralizing information. Most people know at the time it was the religious leaders that basically had a monopoly on religious texts. With that monopoly on physical manuscripts came a monopoly on the interpretation of those texts. So you were looking to your priest to tell you what the Bible meant by this passage or this story. Once the Bible could be printed cheaply enough for all, it decentralized that power so that more people could think for themselves. It was a technology that brought a new level of freedom. It's kind of interesting that this Protestant revolution was dovetailed with the technological revolution of the printing press that decentralized ideas and decentralized power. After millennia of power being concentrated in the hands of the few, there eventually was enough demand for this new type of freedom. And in a lot of ways, it was the technology of the Gutenberg press that enabled it. But to really push it through, it required a change in the thought pattern of the masses. This decentralization of power, by definition, it could only happen as people woke up to the idea. Had the Gutenberg press been invented only to be printed only for the Catholic Church, then it wouldn't have really helped the masses at all. It just would have helped the church print things easier for themselves. it's almost a perfect analogy toward the idea of separation of money and state, is that right now most people don't even see the difference. They don't even really know how money is made besides the fact that the government prints it. If the government controls the printing press of money, they control the language of money. They control how it's made, how it's spent, how it's taxed, and really the cash flow of where that money is going. But when you look at the grand scope of monetary policy, government funding, and all the banks that make billions of dollars for themselves, money is really not in control of the people whatsoever. Andreas Antonopoulos talks about this very idea in his book, The Internet of Money. In addition to providing government services, creating and enforcing laws, most governments also issue their own national currency. In this way, they maintain control of the money supply. Here in the US, the federal government oversees the US Treasury, the Federal Reserve, the IRS, as well as bank regulation. Through these means, government effectively controls money printing, tax rates, interest rates, as well as access to private citizen bank accounts. So if there was no such thing as corruption, maybe this wouldn't be such a big deal, but the conflict of interest arises when the populace is disadvantaged by policies held and enforced and mandated by its own government. Separation of money and state is much like separation of church and state. The idea was that you wouldn't be punished by the government for having differing views on religion. What was so revolutionary at the time was that government no longer had a monopoly on spiritual practice. When the economic system of money separates from the state, the same thing happens. People are free to transact with each other in whatever type of money the public market naturally selects, instead of being forced to use something that the government gets to control. So again, our current system is not really a free market. You are required to use the US dollar for pretty much everything. I think soon enough this will be common knowledge, but our government even requires other countries to use the US dollar as a reserve currency even when they're trading with each other. That's a pretty crazy level of keeping tabs on everybody. So not only does the government get to print free money to get free favors from people, but once that money goes out into the economy to pay for these free things, that dollar bill doesn't end there. It is used by that person to get what they want to pay for their needs. So it continues to spread out into the economy, this injection of poison that waters down all the rest of the money that's already in existence. So this just keeps on repeating over and over and over again. And then people who are buying treasury bills, bonds, they get a measly 2 to 5% return for investing in the government through buying bonds, which is really quaint. In a government with a separation of church and state, however, the government would either need people to volunteer funds toward a project that they really believed in, or the government would have to go out and compete in the market and work and earn that funding to push forward any government project. Much like the rest of us, they would have to go out and work for money. Now, the way that I used to think that the system worked was that we all have to pay taxes when we work hard. We have to let the government take some of that hard-earned money, but at least they're using all those taxes to build us roads, secure national defense, pay for welfare, government housing, maybe even the postal service. My thought was, yeah, we're forced to pay taxes, and then they provide government services with that tax money. Then I learned what actually happens is, yeah, they do tax us on the right to go out and work and provide a living for ourselves, which is crazy enough as it is. But it's not like that tax money is really going toward government projects or roads or anything like that that's helpful to us. My understanding is when they get our tax money back, they use that to pay off the interest on their debt. So it's this impossible equation for them to print off debt because they have to print more debt to pay off old debt. But once you've printed that new money to pay off the old money, now you have this new money, and you also need to print even more money to pay off that new money. And it's just this ridiculous house of cards that is built up over time. So in essence, the government is always broke because the government is always printing more debt. If there was a separation of money and state, the only money that the government would ever have would be money that citizens volunteered to that government. The government would have to provide a service that the public valued enough to contribute funds to. But when you have a monopoly on the printing press of money, much like the Catholic monopoly on spiritual texts, the government also gets the monopoly on the interpretation of money. And by interpretation, we mean tax rates, interest rates, and the rate of inflation. So as more people wake up to what's actually going on within our monetary system, the more that these new technologies will help decentralize power in the best way possible. So in a way, religion and money are both types of languages that help people connect to each other. If that amount of freedom was provided by the separation of church and state, the separation of money and state is going to allow for even higher, more pervasive levels of freedom in society. Because if you think about how many people go to church and are religious in some type of way, even more people are involved in the religion of money. It'd be hard to find even one person that said, no, I don't use money. I don't use any kind of money. Like, I don't think the term money atheist exists. Like, you might have religiously atheist friends, and you might have some friends that go to church, and you might have some friends that just practice religion privately, but you'd be hard pressed to find anybody who doesn't use money at all. So the way I look at it, the separation of money and state is an even bigger idea than the separation of church and state. It's more pervasive. Money affects every aspect of our lives. I mean, even when you go to church, they want a little tithe. It's like a little church tax. Not everybody wants religion, but everybody wants money.